15th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have received apologies this morning from Ross Greer. The first item on our agenda today is a roundtable discussion on the Scottish budget process in practice. I'd therefore like to welcome to the meeting Andy Whitty, Director of Strategic Policy and Corporate Governance, Colleges Scotland, John Wood, Director of Membership and Resources, COSLA, Dr Alison Hosey, Research Officer, Scottish Human Rights Commission, Dave Moxham, Deputy General Secretary, Scottish Trade Union Congress, and Carmen Martinez, Policy and Engagement Lead, Scotland's Women's Budget Group. So I'd like to thank you all for your excellent written submissions. And tend to allow around 90 minutes for this session. I'd like it to be a discussion involving us all. So if witnesses or members would like to be brought into the discussion at any point, please indicate to the clerks and I can then call you. Now, what I've done with, as you will know, there was 11 questions. Some were answered by all, some were not. But I've written them all down in terms of what I think are interesting points in these 11 questions. And lo and behold, at least 2 of them to apply to each of the 5 of you. So I'm just going to pick on someone to kick us off. And we're not going to stick to any script or anything like that, but this is just to ensure that all areas are actually covered this morning. So the first question I'm going to ask, just to open us up, will be to John from COSLA. And in his submission, he says, and I quote, "The 25-26 budget process saw improved engagement between the Scottish Government and COSLA. There was earlier and deeper engagement between the COSLA Resources spokesperson and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government and increased transparency." But how can that be improved even further?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for inviting me and colleagues along this morning. So as we've set out in the COSLA submission, there were certainly some real improvements that we saw in terms of that budget engagement for the 25-26 budget settlement for local government. A lot of those improvements have been, I guess, a couple of years in the making in terms of being part of the Verity House Agreement, which is the sort of key strategic relationship document between local government and the Scottish Government. That document sets out commitments shared between ourselves and ministers in terms of improving engagement on the budget, around exploring and concluding a fiscal framework between local government and Scottish Government, as well as other shared policy commitments. So it's a really key piece of work for us. And broadly, we've seen that reflected in terms of the engagement that we've had from Scottish Government around the budget as well. This year, as we outlined in the submission and as you referenced, Chair, you know, we saw earlier and deeper engagement at both the political and the officer level. That I think that in terms of those improvements, you know, we've seen kind of opportunities at an official level to share COSLA's sort of calculations ahead of the budget settlement coming through. I think that, you know, that good engagement also resulted in a settlement which allowed us, at the very least, between COSLA and Scottish Government to be agreed on what the numbers kind of meant, you know, and I know that there's references in our submission and others around the difficulties in that result from the complexity of the process and the budget settlement across the board, and how, for example, year-on-year comparisons are often difficult. We arrived at a position where we, at an officer level, were agreed on many of those numbers, so that was really positive. Your question, obviously, around kind of what could be improved. Again, improvements ahead of 25-26 meant that there were less announcements that came at short notice for local government, and less an absence of what we've kind of seen in the past in terms of any commitments that were unfunded or for which the funding was unclear. So those improvements kind of flowed through into the budget settlement in that regard. I think that, you know, in terms of COSLA's assessment of the budget, we've made clear in some of our documentation that there were shortcomings around, for example, the the additional funds that were provided for national insurance. However, we understood that there was only a kind of limit to what was available from the Scottish Government in that regard. So yeah, beyond that, Chair, you know, as is set out in our evidence, some improvements that we've seen, but really, really important for us at that officer and political level to ensure that the engagement continues to deepen between councils and Scottish Government.
You have, however, raised concerns that the Scottish Government is still insisting, for example, on maintaining a level of teacher numbers that COSLA don't think is necessary. So is that a cause of continued tension, and where are we in terms of those kind of discussions?
Yeah, so it's certainly an area that continues to be discussed, you know, at the political level, and I think that's clear in terms of the kind of respective positions of COSLA and Scottish Government on that. I don't know if I'd be necessarily the best placed to kind of give an assessment of where we are, other than that, you know, there were commitments made this year that COSLA would seek to work towards a certain level of teacher numbers, and you know, funding has been provided previously in relation to that. The COSLA position has been that that commitment constrains the budget overall. In terms of the process, you know, that was and the kind of focus of this conversation and around engagement between COSLA and the Scottish Government. Again, you know, those things have been very openly discussed, again, at the officer and the political level, so that the kind of line of communication is clear there. I'm not sure necessarily that sort of budget engagement is always going to be the answer to getting us beyond that, but it certainly has helped in this year, ahead of this year, sort of wrapping some of that conversation together, I think allowed an element of progress to be made.
Okay. I should have said, anyone wants to come in at any point, please let me know in the meantime, because no one has indicated they do. I'm going to go to Alison. You've basically said in your submission that several barriers continue to limit the effectiveness of the budget process, and one of the issue is the timing of engagement, which often occurs too late to allow for meaningful external contributions. By the time consultations take place, key decisions have already been made.
Yes. One of the things that I know from listening to the evidence last week with the Auditor General, you referred to the open budget survey work. And when you look at how best practice sits around the world for timing, the timing of key documents being produced helps to influence and inform discussions about the budget and the decisions that need to be made. And we found that the pre-budget scrutiny, the move to pre-budget scrutiny in the summer is a good move. It allows discussions to happen. But there's a lot of feeling from people participating that decisions are already made at that point. And one of the key documents that Scotland doesn't currently produce is a pre-budget statement. And in that pre-budget statement, setting out the general fiscal situation, the general trends of where we think it's going and what might be coming up in the budget, to allow discussions to focus on what might actually be happening rather than reflecting on probably what has already been decided. So I think the timing there of a pre-budget statement to allow that to come into the pre-budget scrutiny stage would be helpful. Okay.
John, you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was interested reading your submission. I think others have mentioned it as well, about this idea of a pre-budget statement. So I was just kind of wanting to... I mean, firstly, on the engagement thing, presumably, I mean, you or anyone else can engage earlier. You don't have to wait for the government to do something. So if you want to say to the government, you've got to spend more money on something, you can do that any time of the year. That doesn't have to wait for the budget. But, I mean, we already have a very complex landscape, and the public is not understanding it. Do you not think, A, that if we have a pre-budget statement, that will also just confuse the public even more? And will it not also cost... You know, we've got a huge increase in civil servants. Is it not just going to mean yet more civil servants and money taken away from frontline services?
I think it's disingenuous to assume that the public won't want to, the budget's too complicated for the public to engage with. I think the reason why it is difficult to engage with is because a lot of the information is too complex. And it is... When I first started looking at it, and I'm not an economist, I'm not a maths specialist, and I'm coming in from a perspective of Joe Public, but with an interest in budgeting. And I found it incredibly difficult to follow decisions, to follow the money, to look at connect budget to outcomes. And I think that in the production of what's considered to be best practice documents, a series of documents, perhaps more streamlined and more accessible, will allow better decision making. It will allow the public to scrutiny, but it will allow better decision making at government. So it's not, I don't think, a waste of time. I think there are complicated documents that could be simplified. And I know the budget is complex, but I do think that conforming with best practice exists for a reason, and the kind of advice that's been given by the International Budget Partnership around what documents should be published to make it possible for good scrutiny and good budgeting is based on the IMF, OECD, World Bank and the Global Institute for Fiscal Transparency. So it's not the Commission's criteria. We've judged the government on the basis of these international best practices. So I do think that looking at what we produce, overhauling perhaps what we do, looking at the timing of when it's produced and simplifying it will make it an easier process for everyone.
Now, you've mentioned international best practices a couple of times. What countries have best practice, and are they devolved parliaments? Because it's one of the issues obviously we have here is that we're quite dependent on decisions made elsewhere in terms of timings, etc. So what other areas in terms of best practice would you like to highlight comparative to Scotland?
The important thing for identifying the best practice is not that if you look at other countries, you're not going to find a country that does everything perfectly. What the budget survey, the Open Budget Survey does is over 240 questions interrogate in really, really fine detail the workings of a budget process. And it's in there that you will find what's considered to be the best practice. So looking to those questions and looking at the guidance for those questions as to what and why things are considered that way. There's lots of examples from different countries that are presented in the Open Budget Survey main report. So they've got examples of where there's good participation, of where there's good transparency efforts by different governments. And it's not a case of just one country. It's looking for the different elements that you can take from and try those out.
Indeed, I suppose it's like a football match. You don't judge them on necessarily one match, but if there's a league table of countries, for example, or devolved parliaments or indeed sub-state legislatures elsewhere, where would Scotland be and who would be at the top?
In terms of the different areas, the legislative scrutiny was really good. We were one of the highest countries in terms of the kind of scrutiny that the parliamentary committees do perform. Where we didn't perform well or as well as other countries was in transparency and public participation. That said, we did this 4 years previous, and Scotland had made notable progress in both those areas over that time. And we are above the global average, but we're sitting slightly below the OECD average for those two areas. So there are some clear, for fiscal transparency, we currently produce 6 out of 8 documents. If Scotland were to produce a pre-budget statement or to produce publicly in-year statements, you would immediately fall into the next category or possibly the top category in terms of not just being slightly limited but substantial providers of information.
But who should we look to in terms of those categories? What other countries should we look to?
Have a look at the International Budget Partnership. There literally is a fantastic interactive system online where you can go and you can pull up all the different countries and look at all the different elements of success.
Given that we're obviously in public session, for the record, is there anywhere where you feel specifically any countries that you think, in terms of transparency, they've got it spot on or near enough it, and that's maybe an area where we should go to emulate? From
memory, New Zealand was topping in quite a lot of areas. Germany had an equivalent to ours in terms of legislative scrutiny. Some particular examples, during the war in Ukraine, Moldova, their Ministry of Finance shared budget summaries, video explainers, gave daily press briefings to maintain public confidence and understanding. Argentina responded to pressures from feminist and social justice groups by showing how budget decisions impact on women.
But these are all countries,
yep.
Independent countries, are not sub-state legislatures like we are, so they're not in the same position. Because obviously a lot of the budget process that we have to work under is decided elsewhere, and so we're kind of ball and chain around our ankle in terms of some of these things. So that's what I'm thinking. You know, is I don't know, Bavaria, you know, California. I don't know.
So the open budget
Ontario,
survey.
Is there anywhere any these places that look at because they're more equivalent to Scotland in terms rather than New Zealand or Argentina or Germany?
It's certainly something that the International Budget Partnership are looking at developing. At the moment, it's only open to countries in terms of the state level. So the UK is the country that is formally included within the survey. We asked if they did sub-level, which they don't, but they offered to provide us with a peer review and substantial support to enable us to follow the methodology to complete it for Scotland on a comparable service. Now, we've been contacted by the International Budget Partnership because there are a couple of other nations which have sub-level government who are interested in doing this as well. So it is something that is potentially going to come. At the moment, we are sort of trailblazers in terms of having done that process. We've also had conversations internally at possibly developing a form of the methodology to look at our local level government, because of course this is at national level government decisions, and it would be interesting to look at this type of process at the local authority level. But at the moment, it's only if a country chooses to follow this methodology that has subnational governments that you've got that data for.
Thanks, Dave. You were keen to come in, and I mean, I was just before I'll let you in a second to know, the Parliament is waiting with bated breath the medium-term financial strategy, the first one for a couple of years, the next few weeks. And you've said in your submission in recent years the MTFS hasn't supported a more strategic approach to financial planning. Much of the blame for this lies with the previous UK government, as fiscal policy was characterised by short-term budget decisions, a lack of spending reviews and general contempt for the Scottish Parliament. However, it also reflects a lack of early Scottish Government engagement with trade unions on strategic decisions about public sector resourcing and public sector pay, unrealistic public sector pay policy published without agreement of unions has led to a regular cycle of strike ballots, etc. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us, you can obviously say what you're going to say if I kind of usurped you a wee bit, but can you say, does this happen elsewhere in the UK, and what do you consider to be a realistic pay sector policy?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't happen elsewhere in the UK. And perhaps with reference to your specific point about Scotland's devolved nature, or its kind of constitutional position, it's arguably more important that it needs to take place at a Scottish level, because as we know, we're working within preset budgets. Scottish Government has, I'd say, a relatively powerful position in relation to the public service decisions of its constituent bodies. Public sector pay policy technically only applies to around 10% of employees, and then we move from across a spectrum of fairly influential through to less influential, depending on whether you're talking about the NHS, whether you're talking about local government and other services. It's not very good for public service workers to exist in the current circumstances where pay policy is kind of set in the budget. It's then kind of applied and kind of taken on by different public bodies. And they take it on with enormously different speeds. I mean, it won't be a surprise to John that we have a frustration, and it's a frustration that could lead to industrial action quite soon, that different government departments or different subsectors of government, when it comes to public sector pay, move at incredibly different paces. We therefore end up with a situation where really we should be looking at 2, 3, 4-year planning. The question should at least be being put to unions. Is there a basis for multi-year deals? And I believe that in some cases they would be open to that, and the knock-on effect of that in terms of overall medium-term budget planning would be relatively positive. And that's not happening just now. That's partly about design, and it's partly about implementation. And if I could say, returning to the point that you put to John, whilst we take on in good faith from both local authority and Scottish Government representatives that things have improved, we still feel that, for instance, things have improved, but we still find a massive difference of opinion about whether average 10% council tax rises or not are appropriate. mean, things have improved, but local government pay settlements are notoriously slow. So what's happening in that process that leads to that position? And there is still a risk that that discussion, or that improved discussion between local government and central government that we're advised to say is true, still has the effect of, in some ways, narrowing political debate. You're actually creating new silos. So, for instance, there's a big element, all of our members, or all of our constituent unions, and a large proportion of civil society and think tanks who want a bigger and wider discussion about the nature of local government revenue raising, and obviously the council tax. However, we are continuously told that that discussion is taking place between local government and the Scottish government, and that there isn't a wider political discourse to be had. So I guess I'd say, we take on faith the improvement. Back to the public sector pay point, if we can move more quickly through a transparent public sector pay policy to getting results from that discourse between local government, and actually begin to have a front foot discussion about how public sector pay in the future can match with other budget considerations and positive public sector reform, then that will be a real positive outcome in the period ahead.
But what do you consider realistic? I mean, the government could say, well, the average public sector worker in Scotland is paid £2,300 more than down south. The sector is 22% of the workforce compared to 17% down south, so it's already a larger sector and it's relatively better paid. So what would be realistic? The government suggested 9% over 3 years. The difficulty, of course, is that inflation could be 1% a year, it could be 5% a year, and that's one of the difficulties, obviously, in multi-year settlements. So what do you consider to be realistic?
Well, I mean, I guess I came here today tooled up more to discuss process than actual numbers, because I thought that was the nature of the inquiry, and I'm certainly not going to write down on a piece of paper now what I think that would be. I mean, the point I would make is, yes, and we accept that it's a good thing that modestly average pay is better in Scotland. It's fairly modest. It goes nowhere near bringing us back to the levels our members used to enjoy a decade ago. It's positive that that is slightly more weighted towards the less well-off, reflecting positive government policy, pay policy generally, in terms of protecting the lowest paid. But, at the end of the day, you wouldn't expect me to say to care workers who are still a million miles away from £15 an hour, or low-paid public sector workers, that they'll have had their bit just because the UK government has done slightly less badly than we have when it comes to pay.
Okay, thank you. Craig?
Thank you, Convener. David, just to extend the Convener's line of questioning, when Shona Robertson appeared before us, she made the point that one of the reasons that the Scottish Government hasn't been transparent or forthcoming in respect to public sector pay is if they put a number out there, that number becomes the floor and you will always negotiate up. So is there an issue now in relation to both sides not necessarily entering into these discussions in good faith? Because if the government comes to you and says it is 9% over 3 years, or we're going to have to make cuts to frontline services, shouldn't you be taking that at face value and then working out how you apportion that 3% on an annualised basis, rather than, if you look at the recent data, rather than public sector wage growth continuing to exceed not just the rest of the UK, but also the private sector at the moment?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends what factors you expect us to accept before we go into that discussion. If we are to accept that completely unproven small business bonus scheme that the Scottish Government spends £300 million a year on is a fact, or that not increasing taxation any further is a fact, then that would be a reasonable suggestion. But what we always do when we enter into these discussions is say, it is a really good thing that low-paid, for our economy and for individuals, that low-paid public sector workers in communities continue to have reasonable wage growth. Now, if you adopt the perspective that none of the other variables in the Scottish Government's budget can be changed, that's a reasonable question to put. We don't. We say that government has other options, and that uprating the pay of some of the most hard-working and some of the lowest-paid people in our communities is a good thing that can be funded in different ways.
Do you also accept that whilst you know, above inflation wage growth for those at the lower end of the spectrum is probably something that would gather public support. There is an increasing focus on the higher levels of the civil service, band A to C, for example, for which they do negotiate. Unions do negotiate with the Scottish Government. Should we be starting to be more prescriptive or granular when we talk about public sector pay? Because there are some public sector workers who are now earning considerably more than their counterparts in the private sector, and who also benefit traditionally from better pension arrangements. And shouldn't perhaps the trade union movement be a little bit more upfront with the public in relation to who you're talking about? Because there are those high-earning workers in the public sector who are getting significant pay increases.
Yeah, well, of course, we advocate and have been successful in achieving, to some extent, higher tax rates in Scotland for those very people, in order that they should, if benefiting on the one hand, make their contribution on the other. So the first thing to say is they pay higher tax, as well as, and I'm not sure I agree with you. I think it's very hard to run comparators between the public and private sectors. I'm sure I could conjure up some pretty well-paid private sector employees as well. And also, there are levels of the civil service, particularly the Scottish Government civil service, where we aren't the negotiator, and the Scottish Government is the negotiator. It's the UK government that undertakes that. So I think it's a slightly more complicated question than you present. I mean, what I would say is this: there has been and will continue to be a very strong trade union emphasis, which I think you've seen come to light in terms of negotiation and making sure that the low and medium well paid are those that benefit most, and both through the tax system and both through the comparator between the UK and Scotland, you'll see that come into effect.
And just finally, in relation to your submission, you say that politicians need to recognise the impact of public sector wage restraint following a decade of austerity, and that wages in the public sector will need to keep pace with private sector wage growth if we are to recruit and retain skilled workers. The IFS, by contrast, in evidence to us, said that we do not find any evidence that larger increases in public sector pay in Scotland in recent years have boosted the retention of public sector workers. So what is the point of higher pay for higher earning civil servants? Is it to retain them, or is it just simply that that's the culture that now persists within those roles and functions?
Well, as I say, I think your comparison needs further investigation. I think the IFS also make the point that there may be other factors when it comes to retention issues. You've got geographical issues. We know that a whole range of our areas, particularly in more remote areas of Scotland, are having problems with retention for other reasons. But, you know, I take that at face value, and it's certainly worth something that's more worthy of being explored more. I do not consider retention to be the primary reason why we should pay public sector workers decently. I think it's their quality of life and their contribution which should be the key factor.
To just go back to that original comment from Shona Robertson in relation to the floor, what more could be done so that the negotiations are A, more transparent, and B, perhaps that you take the heat out of them, so that the government can be perhaps a bit more honest with you about what they can and can't afford?
Well, I don't know. I mean, all I'll say to you, we have the two biggest public spending areas and wage bills in Scotland are the NHS and local government. In the last 4 weeks, there has been an offer, a rejection, an improved offer, and an acceptance, and that's all been tied up in 4 or 5 weeks. When people come late to the negotiating table, and when they're not clear about what they're prepared to offer, they enter unions in, because you see, we're rather democratic. We have to go out and first ask our members by consultative ballot if the offers that have been given to them are in the right sort of area. If they say no, then potentially we have to go back again, and this is the law, this isn't our choice, and consult potentially on industrial action. This is a long process that's laid down for us by legal constraints. So I guess you're possibly proposing a level of light-footedness that isn't available to us.
And just finally, have the Scottish Government tied one hand behind their back at the negotiating table by entering into discussions on the presumption that they will not countenance strike action?
So not counting the
strike action. So they're basically saying they've made virtue of the fact that there haven't been large-scale public sector strikes in Scotland. But does that give you the whip hand at the negotiating table?
I mean, I wouldn't say so, because number one, As I say, those long processes that we're involved in are directional towards industrial action, relatively hard to slow down. We don't get the position that anyone's easy with us at the negotiating table. I think what the Scottish Government is referring to is the fact that the previous government tried to make a virtue of going to war with the unions. Didn't have a particularly positive effect for them down there. The fact that the Scottish Government doesn't make a virtue of that isn't something which enters into the psychology of negotiations. In fact, if anything, it makes us more minded to sit down and listen, because we know that at least somebody isn't going to war with us.
Both Johns want to come in. John Mason and then John Wood.
Thank you. Yes, kind of in the same area, I have to say I thought your paper was very good. It was 4 pages, which is easy to read, and a big emphasis on...
Sharp and to the point.
Exactly. We could raise taxes more, which I totally agree with. I thought the little graph was very good in the 20 countries, showing that countries like Denmark and Norway pay considerably more in tax and get much better public services. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. But specifically on the process of all this, I mean, this year we had, I can't remember exactly when, but I think it was the start of this year, the government said this came out with this 9%, 3%. I mean, do you think that's worthwhile at all? Or should they be speaking to either you as the STUC or individual unions during the autumn and saying, well, what kind of pay settlement would you want, before they've even spoken to COSLA or anyone? I mean, how do you see that process working?
The value of that early engagement may be less about, because the last thing that we want is to, as the STUC or as any unions, is to take away the bargaining rights from individual unions in individual sectors. So I think there is a limitation in the sense of us being able to have an earlier discourse with government and say, or see if you make that 9%, 10.5%, then that will be fine, everyone will be bound with that. I just don't think that works. I think where it is useful and could be useful and far more useful is if the government, in good time, and discussions have taken place, but they've not have taken place early enough, in good time, what some of the other factors might be involved. So the government, I'll give you a completely imaginary example. So this hasn't happened, but government comes to us and says we want to make it 10% over 3 years. I was never going to say 8, even in my imaginary example. Makes it 10% in 3 years. We're like, I don't know if that's really going to do the job. And then we start to potentially talk about other areas of public service reform. We get to talk about potentially multi-year deals. We get to talk about the length of the working week. You can have something which at least sets the tone and sets the terms of what such, a policy might be.
And is that not happening at the moment?
It isn't. I want to be careful with my answer here. It hasn't happened in enough time for that to be something which could be affected through government and through trade union processes.
I mean, should that be happening now for 26, 27? Or?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Camilla.
Sorry, you did. Sorry to comment. I'll be very quick on this. You did make the general point about other countries and tax rates. We are in enormous political and economic trouble if mainstream parties don't start accepting very, very clearly that the proportion of taxes that we are going to pay as a percentage of GDP has to rise. That's because of demography and various other developments in the economy and the green economy. So every single mainstream party should be very aware that there's only one party that benefits if we don't get honest about the levels between each other about the level of taxes that we're going to have to pay to sustain decent public services.
Okay. Well, I'm with you on that, even if I'm not in a party.
John Wood.
Thanks, Stuart. I guess it's just useful for me to pick up on some of Dave's points around pay and sort of bargaining, and also that engagement that happens between COSLA as the employers' organisation for local government, our trade union colleagues, and the Scottish Government in that space as well. So it's kind of rewinding to Dave's initial remarks. I would agree with all of the sentiments around the fact that engagement is absolutely key. You kind of reference council tax, which isn't on the agenda today, but just for the record, absolutely, it's COSLA and Scottish Government's intention to go out and engage properly on that this year, and for that conversation to obviously involve a range of stakeholders. Again, come back to sort of process. So the key bargaining group for non-teaching staff within local government is the Scottish Joint Council, the SGIC, and again, just in the spirit of kind of referencing some of the sort of improvements and good bits of engagement. So we, between ourselves, Scottish Government, and our SGIC trade union side colleagues, had a meeting around about the budget time. I can't remember, Chair, I can confirm in writing exactly when the meeting was, shortly after the draft budget, to sort of clarify that there was a shared understanding between COSLA and the Scottish Government of the figures that were presented, and I think that helped to inform sort of future conversations at the SGIC, and hopefully has informed pay negotiations as well. I think it's really useful for us to have been on the same page at the very least in terms of the local government trade unions understanding what those variables were and what the figures are within the local government settlement, having the same story essentially from COSLA and Scottish ministers. Again, it's maybe not quite within remit for today, but kind of hearing the points around, you know, the fact that we want pay negotiations to be settled sooner rather than later. We'll see obviously what sort of transpires this year. One thing that we were able to achieve with through the SGIC this year was we made the commitment last year that COSLA would put forward a credible offer by the 1st of April. You know, it's not something that we've always managed to do, to have that offer on the table so early. We did manage to do that. Yes, it was rejected, but at the same time, that I think has allowed us to kind of fast forward, hopefully, the negotiations at the SGIC level at the moment. So yeah, it went in through the lens of engagement and process around the budget. There is a lot of engagement that happens sort of beyond the direct negotiation that hopefully eases the path there. And as Dave says, good relationships between COSLA as the employers' organisation and their trade unions. I think that sort of constructive working environment does allow us to make progress. It would be nice for us all, and I think we all strive for this, if at some point, you know, we were spending probably less time negotiating on pay and spending more time looking at how we can work together to improve terms and conditions, how we can work together, you know, with our trade union colleagues to deliver good public service reform for the people that that local government and their partner organisations serve. There have been years where, you know, frankly, certainly from a kind of organisational level, capacity is drawn up by those negotiations, and we always want to minimise that, and multi-year settlements would be a really useful means of doing that. We've not been able to make it happen of late, but certainly something that we all strive towards.
Okay, thank you. Alison, to be followed by Michael.
I was just wanting to follow up on the point that Ms Moxham had made around taxation. It's something that we've talked a lot about at the Commission, where the human rights obligations that the government has to maximise their available resources. So before making cuts to public services, there has to be a look at whether or not the government is actually bringing in as much resource as it can. And I know and I appreciate the limitations that Scotland has in terms of the devolved context, but there are levers that Scotland has that they could use. And we were discussing earlier on around the Landman Economics paper that was produced a few years ago, where there were different routes that the Scottish Government could have taken, which would have brought us at position by next April to quite a different fiscal situation than we are, because we haven't looked at how we kind of reimagine council tax, looking at local wealth taxation, pushing the UK government on, you know, extreme wealth taxation, because there are opportunities there. The UK was reviewed under the ICESCR, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, just recently, and one of the concluding observations coming back was a commitment. The government, UK and Scotland, need to look at their taxation as a means to providing more revenue, rather than immediately looking to making cuts to public services. So that's something that I would want to encourage.
Michael.
Yeah, I think the discussion so far about the negotiation position around public pay is really useful, actually, because it talks to a lot of the evidence we've had, as Mr Hoy highlighted from the Cabinet Secretary. But the public pay accounts for over 50% of the expenditure of the Scottish Government. So on a more strategic level, probably come back to where you started, Alison, in terms of the transparency around the budget. Part of the challenge this committee has found is actually, in the absence of a public sector pay policy, being able to scrutinise the overall spending of the Scottish Government is very challenging. Now, most recently we have had a public sector pay policy, but for 2 years we didn't. So it's, I suppose it's trying to pull this conversation a bit towards more that strategic side of it, in terms of looking at this in the longer term and saying, what could we do to improve the transparency around public sector pay for the longer term to make sure that we're actually being able to scrutinise those bigger figures? Dave, Alison?
All right, sorry.
Is there more actions we could take, do you think, to get the government to be more forthright and open about the assumptions they're working on?
Asking them to produce the, the documentation, the evidence, so that we can scrutinise it. You're quite right. I mean, across all of the different areas, you can't scrutinise if you don't have the information to scrutinise with. I appreciate that we are living in very uncertain times, and things change almost on a monthly basis in terms of big economic shocks seem to come more and more frequently, which makes predicting difficult, but it also makes it even more important that we have a kind of roadmap, even a roadmap that has A, B, C and options instead of just one route, that when things happen, you've got contingency plans. So I think the more information we have, the easier it is to scrutinise. And also in terms of public confidence, I think it is really important that we are aware of what discussions are happening. These are difficult financial times, and I think people are more willing to accept difficult decisions when they understand why they've been taken. Without that public transparency around decisions, it's very difficult. So it's a challenge for parliamentary committees to challenge government to ask for that information.
I was just about to move on to you, Carmen, so...
I was going to say that maybe we go back to that point about the pre-budget statement, and that maybe it is that's one of the reasons why it is important. And I wouldn't see it as a cost, but as a proactive exercise from the government to kind of like disclose where we come from and where we are at the moment and where we need to go to achieve objectives. And so all of these discussions could be had, but the reality is that at least for the last couple of years we've had fiscal updates or updates to Parliament the day before this happened in 2023, the day before the UK budget was announced. There was a statement about X amount of savings being made, and so from like a citizen's perspective, I don't think that feels very transparent in the way that it is done. And so at the moment, again, if we want to engage more with people, if we want that engagement to be meaningful, and if we want to kind of like get rid of that apathy, that feeling from some citizens, we need to make that extra effort to discuss the difficult questions in a proactive manner.
And how do you suggest we do that?
The pre-budget statement and like updates, more regular updates, not on the back of like mounting financial pressure. That's one of the points that we made in our submission. We thought that it was a missed opportunity during this Parliament that there is not a pre-budget statement or that in-year changes are discussed as part of this pre-budget statement, for example.
Yeah, and how early should the pre-budget statement be?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if I have the...
Because it has to be relevant to, because I mean the UK is going to obviously have its own budget, and that would obviously kind of quite a considerable impact on what the Scottish Government would have in its own draft budget. So how valuable would that pre-budget be in that regard?
Committees work on their pre-budget scrutiny during the summer, right? So do you feel as a committee that having the pre-budget statement before the summer would help you with your scrutiny?
Yeah, I personally feel it would. Not particularly. I don't particularly think that it would, but I mean others might have another perspective on that.
I think it
Potentially would. If I could say, I mean, you're right in terms of a lot of variables that move, considerable variables that move in a UK budget. And we have a very, I think part of me what the Mayor's point to, a very tight timetable quite often between the publishing of an autumn budget in the UK and then the need for the Scottish Parliament to look at a budget before the end of the year. It's a very tight period of time as well to do that work. But the absence of longer term fiscal statements or planning strategies means that some of the knowns within this, whether it be around pay progression, assumptions that might be taken about the size of the public workforce over the following year, how many people, how much it's likely to account for in terms of progression. So there are things that could be foregrounded more. I mean, we've had a Cabinet Secretary go to the Net Zero Committee and say essentially that the government knew that the assumptions they were making on pay last year were unrealistic. It was a paper exercise. That was a pretty frank admission from Gillian Martin. So something that gives us... Is it partly about the absence of the MTFS since 2023? Could that be a better process that would help people to understand the structure?
Well, that's what I was going to suggest. The other issue, of course, is that we have the government have said they will agree to the committee's request for a fiscal sustainability debate every year so that we can look to in terms of long-term planning. But the thing I was going to actually ask of Cameron was in terms of the medium-term financial strategy, because what you've said in your submission is that you're not aware of the MTFS being used regularly by the committees. Ideally, it should help them identify any risks that should be in the way of achieving their portfolio's policy objectives. And you want to say that the MTFS should encourage committees to think beyond the immediate current political term to debate how to plan for the policy challenges facing Scotland. So, I mean, one of the concerns we have in terms of committees is they've said to us that they're overwhelmed with work as it is. And frankly, they're kind of leaving the Finance Committee to do most of the heavy lifting in terms of budget scrutiny. I mean, we should be doing a big chunk of the heavy lifting, but they're not really, I don't think, putting in the shift that they perhaps should in terms of this particular area. So how do you feel that we can move that along in terms of the committees?
So each committee has their own pre-budget scrutiny process, right? Do you or the conveners meet after that process? And again, would it be useful for the committees to discuss some of the priorities? Because you as the FPA are always looking at how are we going to finance this, how are we going to implement this policy, etc. And other committees are looking at the qualities or why it is important that this, our policy or this area is important. So we need to, they don't think about how to implement it potentially. I'm not sure, okay? They don't look at the detail of implementation in the way or with the lens that you use. So I wonder, and I mentioned this in my submission as well, I thought that the national outcomes, that inquiry was quite good. This committee was leading it, but other committees were involved. So potentially there is a space for committees to kind of like work together and look at pre-budget scrutiny process in terms of like the big questions that will come up, and that, for example, I know that the Scottish Fiscal Commission is trying to encourage the Scottish Government to look at the long term, to look at they talk about multi-decade budget. I know that has their own risk because things change very quickly, but again, we have the problem of the aging population, decreasing population, and climate change. And so the question in the inquiry was how the MTFS could be further developed, and we thought that it should be further developed by looking at these areas and by also committees thinking about what is going to be at risk within their portfolio. I was going to say
committees tend to in terms of the Parliament, in terms of the Chamber, tend to make their contributions before we get to stage one, but after the draft budget. The issue we've had with committees is that because a committee can't really ask for additional spending out with its portfolio and should really be deliberating over spend within its portfolio, they often tend not to say, let's take it for schools and give it to colleges, or take it from universities and give it to schools or whatever. They tend to be very loath to actually make any real suggestions, frankly. So tends to be a bit of an issue. So the issue is about how realistic it is to suggest that committees who are less than enthusiastic about doing this in the first place because they feel it's not their responsibility, how we can get them to engage. I mean, one of the things that we've suggested, for example, in other evidence is that when new MSPs come in, you know, they have a kind of, you know, a wee bit of a kind of, let's just say, training session, I suppose, on how the budget actually works, etc., because we tend to be far too siloed, and I think that's an important point you're making in terms of the committee-wide engagement. And I think that's often because MSPs feel as if they have to be experts in a number of different fields, or not experts, but they have to have a ground in knowledge, and taking on the workings of the budget is perhaps a bit too much, if you know what I mean, if they don't have a grounding from the start of the parliamentary session when they're first elected. So that's something we're kind of looking at. How can we perhaps increase the kind of financial literacy, if we want to put it in that kind of crude terms, of all parliamentarians?
I'm going to bring up an example that maybe is not going to quite answer your question, but it looks at how we use the money and why it is important that different committees are involved on this. So in terms of, for example, active travel infrastructure, the Scottish Government committed to spending 10% of the transport budget on active infrastructure. And one of the strategic objectives of this active travel framework was to reduce inequalities. Okay, so we have two areas. We have equalities and we have transport here. But despite this, the indicators and the outcomes on the need to improve were focused on the need to improve safety for all, and also on the number of kilometers built. Now, this doesn't tell us anything about how we are trying to improve equalities or how we are looking at equalities through active travel infrastructure. By focusing on number of kilometers built, we are not looking at the different travel patterns, why it is important to have sex disaggregated data when it comes to any. You wouldn't think about it because it's travel or active infrastructure, but actually we use transport differently, and active travel is not different. And our survey in 2023 looked at, had included questions on transport, and 59% of respondents, of women, said that the questions on access and safety of cycle routes was not applicable to them. 34% of respondents felt the same for walking and wheeling routes. And so this is why it is important to include equalities analysis and gender analysis as part of implementation and budget allocations. I'm not even saying, oh, we need to spend more. I'm just saying within the same level of spending, we need to look at how the money is actually used, and whether or not we are going to meet those objectives on equalities and safety.
Well, I think outcomes is something that all members of the committees are quite keen to see, regardless of what area specifically we're looking at. We want to see better outcomes for the money that's actually invested. So I think anything that can help deliver that is obviously going to be very welcome. Craig, followed by Liz.
I don't want to venture an argument that we're kind of wasting our time here, but is there an issue that we've not really addressed, which is that we're arguing for greater transparency? And obviously alongside transparency is accountability, and whilst they're interconnected, but they're not interchangeable, I suppose. So is the realpolitik of the situation, which is that in any 5-year period in Scotland, we have 3 major elections: a Scottish parliamentary election, a Westminster election, and a local government election. Doesn't that work against transparency? Because ultimately the picture's always evolving, and the government can't set out a 5-year plan at the beginning of a new parliament because there's so many variables, partly democratic accountability, that could cut across that. So are we actually arguing for something here that is ultimately unachievable, not because of the devolution settlement, just simply because of the nature in which different democratically accountable bodies are elected and the time frame in which they're elected? And actually, the absence of transparency, if that's what stakeholders perceive it to be, there is actually maybe greater accountability because we get 3 elections in 5 years out of the process. I don't know, Alison, whether or not there's any causal link, perhaps, between transparency and political stability, because I suppose having 3 elections in 5 years does not give you political stability per se.
An expert in the political cycles, but I mean, I take your points. I think it would be an interesting aspect to look at, but I don't think. Still, we're talking a lot, and I was sort of formulating thoughts in my head when you're talking about the difficulties of committees and getting committees to engage in beyond the Finance Committee, getting other committees to engage, and that we can't do scrutiny on this, that and the next thing because we don't have the information, because we don't have that transparency. And I think it's absolutely critical to everything. I think instilling an understanding of the importance of budget is really important for the new lot of MSPs that come in. Workshops that we've done on human rights budgeting, I remember right at the start where some people came along and thought, I don't know why I'm here, the budget's not, I'm not really that interested in the budget. Came away from the day saying, the budget is everything. It's probably the most important policy document that any government produces. It sets out what you're going to do and it sets out what you value. And I think it's really important that that flows down from the budget to, like we're talking about the Programme for Government coming out today. The Programme for Government is your annual reflection on what you are trying to achieve in a policy sense. So that needs to be really clearly set out, connected to the budget. And your national outcomes that we've talked about, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk a bit more about, the National Performance Framework is probably the most underutilised, potentially transformational pieces of that the government has ever brought out, and it's not been utilised in the way that it could, because your national outcomes, you're setting out what Scotland says it wants to achieve on an annual basis. Your Programme for Government sets out how it's going to achieve those outcomes. Your budget has to speak to that, and currently there isn't that dialogue between those three pieces. So I think more transparency is important. But I do appreciate the difficulty in negotiating those political lines around what it is that you're wanting to pursue as a government. But I think in general, without transparency, we don't have the information to scrutinise. We will be doing some work at the Commission on rights budgeting and trying to develop what we've been talking theoretically about over the last few years into more practical tools. And parliamentarians are one of our, and clerics as well, are the kind of key catchment for us to take that work forward. We're doing some work with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as well, who are coming over in July, August this year to look at economic, social, cultural rights, so a lot of the areas under which the devolved Parliament has concerns, and looking at how you can do more transparent work with budgeting. So I disagree. I think transparency is key. I think without that information, you can't make decisions, you can't scrutinise. We can't scrutinise earlier, later, at any point in the budget cycle if we don't have the information with which to do that scrutiny.
Before by Andy.
Really, an observation from what the Auditor General said, namely that one of the real problems is that we don't have a consistency of approach. He was very concerned that the various budget documents that appear, whether that's the budget itself or the medium-term financial strategy or a statement about financial sustainability, it's not easy, particularly in the timescales that they're published, to understand what the consistent approach should be, and it's very difficult for people in local government to take on board what that consistency ought to be. And I think, if anything, there's a great need for us to try to find greater consistency within the approach of what the government's intentions are when it comes to the delivery and how it's going to be funded. And therefore, if we have that consistency, I think the Auditor General was pointing out that we get better scrutiny.
Okay, thanks for that. I mean, Andy, and you were keen to come in and you talk about the fiscal sustainability delivery plan. You say that it would add more value if it covered the following elements: a direction on the fundamental change to how public money is spent, cutting across the different portfolio boundaries, and align economic growth spending and gaps in skill needs.
Yeah, and I think some of that actually speaks into what Craig and others have been saying, and it's about within the landscape where there are multiple elections in a 5-year term, it's how do you get that as much provision of certainty as possible within that. And I think that needs to start with, as you start the parliamentary cycle, the first programme for government. We need to see work towards a parliamentary term spending review set out there, and I think everybody's evidence that's here this morning had multi-year budgeting as an element that they were calling for. And I think what that brings is, as much as possible, security around what the 5-year path is. So by the end of Parliament, ... what is it that wants to be achieved in different areas and over, to deal with the big shifts like demographics, climate change, how do we want to help the economy, how do we deal with alleviating poverty, those big cross-portfolio issues. It's where do you want to be at the end of that? Parliament in those areas, and that helps bring as much certainty as possible, not just for public bodies, but for private investment. And that then allows the investment in the economy. It then, therefore, drives, from our point of view, what the skill needs are that are required. And so when you're looking at decisions, and other public bodies as well, how does what they're delivering help that strategic direction? And I think it's that. So some of the things that touched on there was really about how you link the decisions now with priorities and the direction at a more strategic level. So it's almost like a whole of government approach to it. So you have your ambitions for economic growth. You have your priorities and targets set out. You can lay those out across the years. I think reform and where the reform in different parts of the public sector plays into this needs to be much more integrated into these documents. So, there is a clear plan of how the reform is going to help and be transformed and go forward, and also, clearly resourced as well and supported. But if you have that gives that direction that you want to achieve in these bigger policy areas, and it allows each portfolio to link its spending to that. But the crucial thing is, because you say, well, don't they do that anyway? I think it's the crucial thing is across the portfolios. So rather than just, individual departments, individual civil servant groups, CabSex, private office, just saying, well, I've got to try and deliver all of these with a reducing budget. How can I manage that? It's actually taking those decisions sort of more portfolio-wide. That's why I sort of described it as that whole of government approach, and aligning the budget planning with those national priorities, and so that spending across portfolios starts collectively doing that. So in the last budget round, between the draft budget and the final budget, the college sector gained an extra £3.5 million, which is a relatively small amount of money. But the key thing was that came from two different portfolios. It wasn't from the education portfolio. So it was starting to deliver on the priorities of two of the portfolios. One was about offshore wind, and one was about health and social care partnership. Health and social care staff training, and it was starting to deliver policy drivers in different portfolio areas. So you could see where, when you start looking at things across portfolios, you can actually see where there's those multiple benefits. An example of where it's not worked is, Audit Scotland, really clear 17% real terms cut to the college budget. So when you just start looking at single portfolios, you're not looking at that bigger picture of it's with all of these big drivers like the change in demographics and climate, trying to help the economy and those in poverty. The common element to all of that is skills are needed. People need skilled up, probably re-skilled from the career they started with, and probably needing that several times. And all the surveys show that it's high-end technical skills that are the majority of those jobs. That's where the colleges absolutely come in. So when you start stepping back and saying, well, how does each portfolio play into, not just colleges, we're talking about the public body, public sector in general, how does it play across, what is it that I can use my spend for that actually helps that wider delivery of the overall priorities? I think we're getting into a place where we're having more mature conversations around where spend is.
Okay, thank you. John, to be followed by Dave. John Wood.
John Wood, yeah. So, just briefly, I would so I'd agree with everything that Andy's just kind of put on the table there around, and I guess it speaks to an extent to Mr Mara's question around what other sort of practical things would we want to put in place in order to give us that stability that could inform sort of pay on a longer term basis. And just to go back to that one, absolutely, you know, the kind of medium term, the MTFS is something that that is helpful for local government in terms of budget planning. Would be helpful, you know, to kind of see that regularly updated in order to inform those local decisions. You know, the suggestion around kind of parliamentary term spending reviews as well obviously would add to allowing us to kind of plan along the medium term. I guess here one of the points I wanted to make, and so obviously kind of recognising that question around, I guess, the three big sort of spheres of government and how their electoral cycles work together or don't. I think it's a really good question, you know, in terms of how those fit or probably don't fit together to allow financial planning for the public sector. Certainly something that local government kind of feels in terms of that wider system essentially tying us into that annual cycle of budget planning. It's perhaps not fair for me to compare necessarily how accountable each of those bits of the system are, but I suppose just wanted to kind of speak to just how accountable things are at the local authority level. And I would be interested, and probably offline actually, to kind of pick up that question that Alison raises around, you know, if there was an ability to kind of apply that sort of global comparator to local government in Scotland as well, because I would like to think that you know, we would come out as a highly accountable sphere of government, you know, and just whether it's our kind of annual audited accounts, you know, the really useful scrutiny from the Accounts Commission, sort of budget consultation and engagement that local authorities do locally on an annual basis and on specific decisions that are made. You know, the amount of the level of transparency, the public meetings that are held in order to make local decisions, spending decisions. I think that leads to a very, very high degree of accountability locally. That sometimes you know, doesn't necessarily mean that the decisions that councils have to make are any more palatable, because, you know, we're facing such financial constraint at the moment. But at the very least, that accountability, I think, is something that local government sort of has on its side. Obviously, the you know, kind of recent budgets that have been agreed at a local level have seen our elected members come under intense scrutiny. Sometimes that's, you know, bordered into kind of abuse online, which COSLA has been working with its members and other agencies to try and address. But that level of accountability, I think, is very, very strong within local government, and would be interested, I guess, you know, maybe not for this committee, but to think about the comparison between how accountable councils are in Scotland versus local government in other bits of the world, and also comparing that to, you know, Scottish Parliament and Westminster as well.
Okay, thank you. Dave?
Transparency and accountability, and I think maybe touching on a couple of the points here, the role of the committee is how wide and extensive it can be. Maybe I'm wrong here, but is there potential to be a bit clearer at the outset about whether we expect the outcomes that we're measuring to be largely quantified or qualified, in the sense of, you know, we talk about teacher numbers. If there's a disagreement about teacher numbers, is that because pupil numbers have fallen? Is it because teachers need more teaching time because they're stressed through the roof? What is the aim of, you know, what is the aim of the spend, and to what extent can it be qualified and quantified? And I think you're right, Andy. I mean, I think there's certain things we might want to quantify, the number of technical places that FE's turning out because we've identified a skill shortage in the emerging green economy. That, I can argue, can be quantified, but there's also going to be qualitative outcomes, which are different in the way that you measure them, possibly more open to interpretation. Do we want working class people to have better access to education and happier lives? I would answer yes to that question too, but it may be more difficult to quantify. So if we start by saying we think this can play a role in positive qualitative outcomes, but these are very focused on precise quantitative outcomes. I mean, just to go back to the green economy, I mean, if I had £1 for every time government had told me that X amount of spending in the green economy was going to produce tens of thousands of jobs compared to the number that they created. I mean, this just creates, there's no way to be accountable if you haven't got a more precise understanding and a more granular understanding of how is that going to happen. And at the moment, I think, as I say, I don't think that's possible everywhere, which is where you move to your qualitative outcomes. But I think there are outcomes, and at least making the distinction of how quantitative you can realistically expect to be at the end of the process would be a not bad discipline for everyone to engage in.
Andy?
No, I was just going to pick up on the point you made, Dave, about colleges serving the local community, and I think looking at outcomes, for colleges and probably other public bodies is around what do you want to achieve locally, nationally, internationally, and I think that local regional space, it's different elements that may be from at a national level, and so some things will be at a national level, but absolutely that locality of colleges and trying to service local community. The challenge at the moment is there's unmet demand at the same time as we've got the 17% real terms cut, and yet everybody talks about the understanding and value of colleges to deliver the skills that are needed. So there's a mismatch somewhere in the system, in the process, and I suppose that's where that thinking around cross-portfolio came from. And I think looking at it that way, yeah, data is important. I think that was touched on quite a few of the written submissions ahead as well. I think looking at where it impacts on the data that needs to be made available and how it's made available so that these scrutinies can be done, and it impacts on, I think, the transparency of the reporting and the governance around it. All that would need to be worked through. It needs to be looked at differently. But I think that's really important to do, and recognising then where reform can fit in, both planned reform, and there's various parts of the public sector, including colleges, of course, going through reform at the moment. It
I see it making a lot of my colleagues nervous with the continued use of the word reform. Small R indeed, yes, yeah. There's that pre-planned reform which you then need to have a clear plan of how that's going to be brought in and a costed plan of how that's going to be done. But the other side of reform, and I'm still talking about small r here, the other side of reform is within the process we need to create that fiscal space within portfolios to look at collaboration, innovation, doing things differently. If I give an example, colleges receive funding to teach, and that's the monies they get. Therefore, it's difficult for them to find headroom to start looking at different curriculum areas, developing what might be needed in order to pivot to different subjects and different skill sets and areas like that. And so finding a way of creating that fiscal headroom and fiscal capacity to, within all portfolios, to sort of how do you bring innovation in and collaboration in, finding ways of producing and reaching those outputs, be it local, national, international level, without necessarily any additional spend. I mean, there's work at the moment around the apprenticeship flow of funding and how that can be streamlined. That's not looking at additional resource for apprenticeships, it's looking at how it's best used and utilised to enable more to be focused on the learner, and therefore you can help more learners with it. Okay. I'm going to turn to public engagement now, actually, and I'm going to bring in Alison and then Carmen on this, specifically because there's quite a lot in both with your papers in terms of that particular issue. So, what you've said, Alison, is you've said that public engagement in the budget process is growing, but significant barriers remain. And you say current efforts tend to focus more on consultation than genuine co-production. And you go on to say that targeted outreach to marginalised communities is also vital, as these groups are often underrepresented in budgetary decisions. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us how this would actually work. You talk about a co-development model in which communities, civil society and Parliament are meaningfully involved in shaping fiscal priorities before decisions are finalised. But how would that actually work in terms of the white heat of the kind of budget process that we kind of operate under at the moment?
I think there are lots of different ways of going about good participatory work. But I think actually just going into the last conversation around getting other committees to look at fiscal information and fiscal aspects of the work that they do is probably a good place to start. The number of inquiries and different subject area investigations that the different committees do and discuss, if they all involved aspects of looking at the financial issues related to those areas, it's a way of bringing in discussion around. Then by the time it comes to the budget process, when there is wider participation, people coming in to talk, those discussions have already been happening. So evidence that you're taking in inquiries to reaching different audiences, not about the budget. But why not? Why not include issues around the budget in all of the different areas that committees look at? That way you're widening discussion around budget, you're starting an educative discussion around money and the relevance to the different policy areas, and you're bringing that into every discussion. So that as a platform starts to widen out who talks about money and who talks about what matters. In terms of other participatory outreach, there are lots of good examples of practice that we could draw on. And again, I'd ask you to look at the report from the wider global report from the Open Budget Survey, because they do draw on different examples of good practice that have been tried elsewhere, and I can certainly send links to that to the committee. But fundamentally, having access to the right information, to have accessible information, allows those discussions to start, and that kind of any efforts of co-productive work has to begin with available information to be able to discuss. So that would be my starting point.
But is there a wider demand for this, frankly? I mean, how many people, for example, you know, in Scotland, do you think would be really interested in this kind of stuff? I mean, a lot of people are interested in having a good public services, you know, but not necessarily a too high a council tax. I mean, beyond that, you know, they want to make sure that the streets are lit well, that they're safe, and you know, the schools are good, etc., as we all know. But do they want to really get into the granularity of budgetary decisions? I think that's why I suppose they elect people, is it not, really, to do that? And then they can judge them on their performance or not. I mean, you know, I would be surprised if more than 1% of Scotland's population, frankly, would be interested in this. And I've been elected in 1992, local government, Scottish Parliament, and I'm just not seeing there's a demand out there for this kind of granularity of budgetary information from the wider public. Perhaps stakeholders and organisations, certainly, but not the general populace. It is unfortunate, I think it is, and the media certainly don't report much of what we do in terms of these kind of deliberations.
But for me, I think that's part of the problem is how we look at that, and that people can't engage with something that they can't understand or access. So it's a classic chicken and egg scenario. If budget documents are technical, dense and hard to follow, then it's no surprise if you don't get engagement from the general public. I think it's not a reason to give up, it's a reason to do better. We need to have better, more transparent, accessible information if you intend for people to engage. And I think that we would never accept the same kind of reasoning in other areas of public life. Like if you imagine saying we shouldn't bother making polling stations accessible because...
No, but I don't think anyone's saying we shouldn't bother. I'm just saying that there has to be a realistic level of what light engagement's likely to be. I mean, no one is more interested in having a wider discourse about the budget than the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. None of us want to see fewer people engaged. We want to see more people. I mean, everyone gets in the committee gets excited when we hear that a tweet on something that we've done has been reached 5,000 people or 10,000 people. But there's still the bottom line is you know, so folk do recognise the work that we do, because people in this committee work really hard and are dedicated to doing the best job possible. But all I'm trying to suggest is that, You know, it's never going to be something that's talked about the way, you know, did you watch a match last night? Never mind a match, actually. What about the block grant adjustment? You know, I mean, you know, and I mean, I understand what you're saying, you know, trying to make things simpler. And the Scottish Fiscal Commission has done a lot to make things very presentable and very accessible. But there still is, it's still got to be something you can take a horse to water, if you know what I mean. So there's real issues there. So that's why I'm looking for practical steps to see how we can do that. And thinking about the budget cycle and etc. and all the moving parts to it. You know, can that really be done to an extent that would involve a much larger group of people? Because I mean, if there is, I mean, this committee would buy into it. Obviously, we would.
No, and I think I genuinely think the committees and the committees as a whole have been doing a good job with this new form of kind of pre-budget scrutiny. I think that when you look at the scoring of the Open Budget Survey, the deficit is in government consultation and government work with the general public in terms of that more participative discussions around the budget. The parliamentary side of things is actually quite strong, and there's maybe ways of looking at how the government can draw on the experience of what the Parliament does and some interactive work, so you're not repeating the same questions. But I do think, I still go back to the point that if you don't have the information available for people to be able to engage, then they're not going to engage. And so you don't really know what a genuine level of engagement. You don't know. My household talks about budgets all the time, partly because of my invested in this work. But everything, the budget is relevant to everything. And getting a wider understanding of just how important it is to the decisions that we make when we vote. These are important things for the public to take on board. If you don't have the information, you can't scrutinise. You can't have those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I do completely agree. I mean, sometimes the local authorities, and for example, have put out flyers which say this is where we raise the money, this is how much we raise, this is where it comes from, because a lot of people think the councils are run by the money raised by the council tax, and fees, charges, grants, etc., being the overwhelming majority of it. You know, and then they'll say this is what we spend it on. So you get those sporadically now and again. I don't know what attention's paid to that. So I think there have been efforts over many years. But Carmen, how would you suggest we engage further with the wider population outside the parliamentary
I think
stakeholder bubble?
One of the points that we made in our submission is that maybe some of the pre-budget scrutiny staff assume certain level of knowledge already, so that can be a barrier for people. And so I kind of like second Alison's point about information being accessible. But I suppose the work also needs to be resourced. So last year we supported a group of women to engage with the budget process, and there was a submission to your inquiry about the pre-budget, and my colleague Heather was here on their behalf. But all this was done through a series of sessions, looking at the budget, looking at gender budgeting, etc. So that is time and resource that you need to spend to kind of like engage with particular group of people. But the Parliament has also a participation team, as far as I'm aware. So there might be a scope to look at how committees could work alongside that participation team to engage with more people around the budget. But another point I would like to make is that this engagement needs to be meaningful, because while some people might have their own opinions as to where resources should go or what is needed, etc., if then the committee is not going to take on board their points, or the Scottish Government is not going to take on board their points, or all the decisions are made, those need to be explained as well. And I think we made that point in our local budgets review. So you can have consultations, and people might want, I don't know, less cars in the city. But councils very rarely might make the decision of, unfortunately, we cannot do this at this point, because that would require X amount of money being invested into public transport, and we have other priorities at the moment, and explain them. So, you know, you can ask people, or you can try to engage with people, but equally, I think people deserve then to have an answer or to have information as to why maybe their concerns haven't been taken on board in relation to the budget.
Okay, Craig.
Just one question about the whole ecosystem of bodies that could hold the Scottish Government accountable and could push for greater transparency. Isn't there also perhaps an inherent contradiction here, which is many of those organisations themselves are either directly or indirectly funded by the Scottish Government? So, for example, the Scottish Women's Budget group is partly funded, I think, probably by the Scottish Government through Inspiring Scotland or directly. Is there an issue, therefore, that the ecosystem of bodies in Scotland, which we now call civic society, in many respects are actually funded by the Scottish Government? So in terms of being open, honest and critical with the Scottish Government, sometimes perhaps do you pull your punches because you are actually reliant upon the Scottish budget for that funding?
Well, that's why I said that the Scottish Parliament has a participation team and they can use, and that will be neutral. But also, I think Shona Robinson not long ago said that the Scottish Women's Budget Group was a critical friend. So I think when we have to, if we have any concerns or if we have to be critical of something that the government has done, we are the first ones who are calling for more transparency, for better analysis of sex disaggregated data, and for equalities analysis to be embedded in the process. So I understand your concerns, but at the same time, I think we are still critical of the government when we have to be.
Dave?
I better mention there's an organisation that's partly funded by the Scottish Government. We certainly don't pull our punches. I recognise the risk, and organisations like ours almost on a weekly basis just ask ourselves the question mentally or through other rigorous processes, are we pulling our punches? And our conclusion is we're not. And I guess the best way to judge that might be to look at the comments that are being made by independently funded charitable organisations. So are your Carnegie Trusts of this world disagreeing with your government-funded organisations of this world? Our certain experience around work that we're doing in civil society, around taxation and poverty, is that we're not hearing a different view from organisations that receive government funding from kind of charitable organisations who should theoretically be more independent. But it's always worth watching to make sure that the area of civil society that does receive some funding isn't massively out of step with those others. I mean, my current view would be no, but I think it's a very fair question.
I would like to add another point, and it's actually, thanks to that funding, certain voices are heard as well, and that's why we can make a point about, gender analysis being embedded in the budget and the importance of that, because without that support, then we wouldn't be able to make those points, and I think they're important.
Okay, folks. Well, thanks very much. Everyone no one is down to ask any questions, but I want everyone to have an opportunity to make a final point before we wind up. So if there's any points you feel we haven't touched on or we haven't touched on enough, I'll let you in a second, John, then I'd like people to be able to make a final point. John, you'll be the last person to speak because you opened for us. So our other guests, if you can think about any final, you don't have to, but if anyone wants any final point on any issue in relation to this inquiry, please do so. But first, John.
Well, thanks. Maybe people can incorporate this in their answer. But in COSLA's representation, they did talk a bit about prevention and early intervention. And I just wonder what people think generally. How, should we be doing that better in the budget process? Should there be lines that say, well, this is prevention, or this is it, and this is early intervention, this is not? Or is that just impossible? I mean, something like colleges, you can argue is both early intervention and just normal practice. Thanks.
Okay, if anyone wants to answer that. So anyone, okay, so final points, who wants to go first? Dave?
Follow on. I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to that, and maybe I'm just giving an example of something that Alice and I were talking about earlier. I was involved at the time of the Christie review, and at the time of Christie, we should have all been saying that about now. Those proper interventions should have been potentially measurable. Yet I most often hear about the Christie review just now when somebody needs to make a relatively short-term saving, which is actually completely opposite of what Christie argued. He argued that these interventions would be long-term preventative. And therefore, had we marked up at the time that they were long-term preventative and marked alongside some other initiatives, as I spoke about earlier, these are short-term quantitative. You can be short-term quantitative really about the government's relatively successful child payment scheme, because you should be able to quantify how many people are taken out of poverty on a fairly statistical basis. It might not be the answer to all of the problems that people face, but you should be able to quantify it. So to be able to better adjudicate or to better combine what our expectations are in terms of these outcomes, I think would be incredibly helpful.
Okay. Now, that's not the final point you want to make, is it, Dave, this morning? That's not.
Well, you already drew all my main points out of me when I started, so I don't have anything particular to.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Andy.
So I talked earlier about, just addressing your point, John, I talked earlier about sort of multi-stream funding in the sense of from different portfolios but I think all of that and the specific education funding needs to be related to outcomes. And I think giving that then with the flexibility and as much as possible a single pot from within each portfolio, I think is more helpful in that flexibility to be able to utilise that as best needed within the region, because all the evidence is the economic growth is going to come from regional economic growth, and so the colleges need that flexibility within that national framework to actually deliver at that regional level. And my only other point is, we touched on it briefly, the national performance framework. I think there's more that could be explored and utilised and used in that, because you do get those broad areas of outcomes and areas for outcomes which could across portfolios in many cases. So I think there is something, I know others mentioned it, around where the national performance framework plays within the various documentations in the process.
Okay, thank you very much. Alison?
2 points. Firstly, on the preventative spend, I think, as others have said, the connection to outcomes, I think, is really important. We need to set out better, the government needs to set out what it is they're trying to achieve with that specific visions that then connect to the budget, so that you can then scrutinise at the other end, did we achieve what we were trying to achieve? And if we didn't, was it because it was the wrong policy, or was it because there was not enough money spent on the right policy? And preventative spend, we all know can save money in the longer term, but unless we set out how we are trying to achieve that, we can't measure it against anything. And there aren't any lines in the budget that say preventative spend, and perhaps there should be for the next cycle, but a way of looking at the budget and actually interpreting what is preventative, what would contribute to preventative. But that means setting out your vision and then looking at the other end, and at points in between as to whether or not we're achieving that. But in relation to, I suppose my main point I want to go back to is transparency really, really matters. And I think that to give a very micro example, a piece of work that we did recently looking at the Coming Home programme that the government set out, that 20 million was given to health and social care partnerships back in 2021 with a view that it was going to be spent on facilitating a route from people in institutions to live at home. And the Coming Home Fund, we were able to look at it and only managed to trace just over 12.5 million of that 20 million, and the majority of it was unspent. And so, again, there's no clarity on the funds that are available at the end of the plan. We don't really know what happened to the money. So when we're saying we're living in times of fiscal constraint and that there's no money available, there's money wasted, or there's money not being accounted for. And it's not saying that anything nefarious has happened to that money, we just don't know where it's gone. And if we can't follow the money, we can't see where the slippage is, we can't see where the available funds could come from. So we need that transparency to be able to follow the money, to be able to scrutinise well, and to be able to look at all of the sources that we have available to us.
We do try and pick some of that up in the autumn and spring revisions. In actual fact, where money's unspent, and it tends not to be unspent, it tends to be transferred to other portfolios where there's much more pressure. And I mean, in terms of the preventive spend, we did the government did provide 500 million over 3 years in 2019 11 for that, but the difficulty was that there didn't seem to be any disinvestment in areas that were less effective expenditure, and that was one of the issues I think that it came up against. You know, people still obstinately progressing with spending money where they weren't getting the kind of return one would expect in terms of outcomes, and so that tended not to continue. But preventive spend, I mean, John has been messianic, John Mason, about this for many years, haven't you, John? Okay. And we do still as a committee support, you know, the use of preventive spend wherever it can be implemented. Carmen.
So I made already the point about gender analysis, the importance of this, and monitoring of outcomes linked to spending. So on preventative spending, I would like to make a point about policy coherence and transparency. And I'm going to refer to the way social care is delivered. So because of this, it is local authorities delivering social care. It's not really under the Scottish Government's control how much money is spent on this. And this is kind of like crucial to understand the links between the way in which local authorities allocate budgets to joint boards and what we refer to as the implementation gap. And this means that with recent budgetary constraints, we have seen integrated joint boards increasingly making decisions which are kind of like at odds with the Scottish Government's understanding of health and social care services as an essential pillar of public services. And for example, our research with the Glasgow Disability Alliance identified the impact that the increase in repayment of non-residential social care charges from 50% to 75% from April 2023 was having on women. And likewise, Edinburgh Integrated Joint Board recently, in October, proposed to cut up to 4.5 million of their grants programme, deprioritizing preventative approaches, as we highlighted in a short analysis that we published. So I suppose the point that I want to make is that the budget process going forward maybe should focus or try to correct this, because we have the objectives, or kind of like a route map from the Scottish Government, but then when it comes to implementation, it looks very, very different. And so then we go back to the issues with transparency and being unable to follow the money.
Okay, thank you for that. And finally, John Wood.
Yeah, so I mean, just to respond a bit of that, kind of some of those concluding remarks. Obviously, you know, the local accountability element of public services is hugely important, something that needs to be preserved. Yes, sometimes that's at odds with, you know, what is, you know, kind of discussed at national level or agreed at national level. You know, it's a complex system in that regard. So when we're talking about budget scrutiny, it's difficult, I guess, to look at it from one lens, right, or with one lens only. And I understand that will be a challenge for this and other committees in terms of, you know, being able to scrutinise the public purse, essentially, whilst there is, you know, there's that really important layer of local accountability as well. So just in terms of some other remarks, I would absolutely agree with, you know, the point made around the need for continued focus on prevention. I think, you know, a couple of participants today have mentioned Christie. I think there's absolutely no shame in us continuing to stick to those principles that Christie set out in that report. They still hold true today and should be what we're aspiring to in terms of, you know, breaking down barriers between budgets, pooling budgets and aiming for shared outcomes, and investing in prevention. In terms of, you know, would it be helpful to identify that as a budget line? I'm not quite sure, but certainly it would be really useful to continue to look at public budgets through that lens. And then finally, I suppose, just reiterating some points that were in our written evidence and that have been spoken about today. So yes, you know, as Alison has said, we talk quite a lot about the kind of complexity of this, but that doesn't mean that we should try to make it more accessible and more accountable and more transparent. So, you know, that kind of continued effort across you know, between Parliament, local government, Civic Scotland, really, really important. And yes, it would be good to see some of those key documents, and also to have those key documents working together. So whether it's the medium-term financial strategy, public sector pay policy, you know, the national performance framework, they're all really important. It's important that those documents work together. And I think that in doing so, then that would, as has been suggested today, help with greater transparency and scrutiny of those budgets.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our witnesses this morning. We will have a final evidence session with the Scottish Government in the next couple of weeks. So that concludes the public part of our meeting. The next part of our agenda will be discussed in private, a consideration of a work programme. So I'll just call a 5-minute break and then we'll move into private session.